Normandy, France. Summer of 1944. The air still carried the echo of distant gunfire, a dull thunder rolling across the gray morning sky. Fields once green were now torn by craters and burned-out vehicles. In a shallow ditch near a hedgerow, a young German woman, a signals assistant in the Luftwaffe Auxiliary Service, sat trembling, her uniform streaked with mud and fear. For weeks, propaganda broadcasts had told her what to expect if captured: humiliation, brutality, vengeance. The British, she was told, had no mercy for Germans, especially not for women who had worn the eagle insignia. But as the rumble of engines grew closer, reality took a different shape. British infantry, calm, organized, faces hardened by exhaustion but not cruelty, moved cautiously through the wreckage. One of them spotted her. Their eyes met. She braced for the strike, the shouting, the retribution that had been promised in every story she'd been told. Instead, the soldier simply raised a hand, signaling her not to move, and called for a medic. His voice was steady, almost gentle. Another soldier offered water from his canteen, his hand trembling slightly from fatigue, not rage. In that instant, something inside her fractured. Not from violence, but from recognition. These were not the monsters she had imagined. They were men, tired and human, just as afraid and just as bound by orders as she had been. She lowered her head, not in defeat, but in disbelief, and as she whispered a quiet "Danke" under her breath, the old certainty, the idea of who the enemy truly was, vanished like smoke in the morning wind. That moment was the beginning of her transformation, and of countless others across a collapsing front. The war was turning. By the summer of 1944, the war that had once seemed unstoppable for Germany was collapsing in on itself. The Allied invasion of Normandy, Operation Overlord, had broken through Hitler's so-called Atlantic Wall. For years, the German people had been told that no foreign army would ever step foot on their soil, that their Führer's fortress Europe was impenetrable. Yet by June, Allied tanks were rolling through French villages once occupied by the Wehrmacht, and the illusion of invincibility began to crumble. Behind the front lines, thousands of women served the Reich not as soldiers, but as auxiliaries, radio operators, clerks, nurses, and air defense assistants. Known as Helferinnen, they were trained to obey, to serve, and to believe. Propaganda had been their constant companion. Pamphlets, newsreels, and speeches describing the Allies as barbarians intent on revenge. Every channel of German communication painted the British and Americans as cruel occupiers who would destroy their honor and their lives. For many of these women, this was their first time near an active front. Their training had been efficient but shallow, built on obedience and ideology rather than combat survival. They were told that surrender was shameful, that capture meant torture or worse. Yet by mid-July, with the Allies advancing through the Bocage countryside, surrender had become the only path left. The propaganda machine. The Nazi regime understood that fear was a weapon. Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda spread terrifying tales of what happened when the Bolsheviks or the British took prisoners, distorted half-truths designed to harden resistance. Posters warned German women that Allied soldiers would treat them like cattle. Leaflets and radio addresses urged them to fight or take their own lives rather than fall into enemy hands. Inside Germany, morale reports from the Wehrmacht propaganda department noted the growing anxiety among civilians and auxiliaries alike. The fear of capture, one 1944 report read, is stronger among women than men. They expect the worst. But these expectations were built on lies. In reality, the British command had issued strict instructions on the humane treatment of all prisoners, male or female. The Geneva Convention of 1929 had set clear rules, and the Allies, especially Britain, prided themselves on adherence to it, even when facing a regime that had shown little mercy in return. Still, none of that mattered to a young woman sitting in a trench with the enemy approaching. In her mind, she was waiting for the inevitable, the moment when the enemy revealed its monstrous face. Life on the Western Front. By July 1944, Allied troops had established a solid foothold in Normandy. Villages like Caen and Saint-Lô had been reduced to rubble. German lines were fracturing under constant bombardment. Amid the chaos, non-combat personnel, secretaries, radio operators, medical orderlies, were left behind as frontline units retreated. Many were captured not in battle, but in confusion, left with no orders and no transportation. These women had lived under strict discipline. Their daily routines were governed by command structure and ideological control. Each morning began with roll call and ended with curfews and news bulletins filled with half-truths. To them, the war was still a distant thing. Until it wasn't. When British and Canadian troops swept through villages once manned by German communications units, they found abandoned radios still humming with Berlin broadcasts, half-packed suitcases and handwritten letters never sent. Among the captured were dozens of Helferinnen, some crying, some defiant, others too numb to react. A different kind of army. To these women, the British army that captured them was alien in every sense. Its structure, discipline, and culture stood in stark contrast to the totalitarian rigidity of the Nazi war machine. The British soldiers who encountered them were weary men, veterans of North Africa, Italy, and now France. They had seen death in every form, but most had little hatred left to spare. For many, these German women weren't the enemy. They were young, frightened, and far removed from the frontline fanaticism of the SS. The British soldiers had lost comrades to the Luftwaffe's bombs, yet face-to-face, vengeance rarely came. What came instead was fatigue. And surprisingly, decency. British war diaries and regimental reports from 1944 record the capture of several all-female communications detachments. In most cases, the women were processed as POWs under Geneva Convention Article 7, which guaranteed humane treatment and protection from harm. They were transported to temporary holding areas, given rations, and interrogated, not brutally, but professionally. The aim was intelligence, not revenge. For the German women, this treatment was disorienting. It clashed violently with the image of the enemy they had grown up fearing. Many had never spoken to a foreigner before. Now, they were dependent on them for food and safety. The collapse of certainty in that small moment of capture, the instant between fear and realization, a psychological transformation began. Years of conditioning cracked under the weight of simple gestures. A soldier offering water, a medic bandaging a wound, a guard allowing a brief letter home. Historians later called this the disillusion of indoctrination. A quiet, human unraveling that spread through captured German ranks, especially among younger auxiliaries. British intelligence reports noted that these women often showed signs of confusion rather than defiance. They were not hardened Nazis, one officer wrote. They were misled, frightened, and astonished to find decency where they expected brutality. As Allied forces advanced deeper into occupied France, this pattern repeated again and again. In captured villages, British troops found medical tents staffed by German nurses who stayed with the wounded rather than flee. Many were taken prisoner alongside their patients and treated as colleagues, not enemies. It was in these moments that the idea of the enemy began to dissolve. Not through propaganda or politics, but through direct, undeniable human experience. Shadows of the past, yet the fear did not vanish overnight. Many prisoners refused to believe what they saw. They waited for the punishment to come later, convinced that kindness was a trick, a prelude to cruelty. Some were haunted by guilt. Guilt for serving, for believing, for surviving when others had not. Inside the Allied camps, rumors circulated that they would be shipped to Siberia, or that the Red Cross parcels were poisoned. Even as evidence contradicted the myths, it took time for trust to grow. But for one woman, the one whose story begins our film, that trust began on that first day of capture, when she was treated not as a trophy of war, but as a human being. That moment, small as it seemed, would echo through her memory for the rest of her life. And beyond her story lay a much larger one, the clash between ideology and empathy that defined the war's final years. The winds of change were sweeping across Europe, and even those raised on hatred were beginning to see the truth behind the smoke. That truth would come into sharper focus as the British camps filled, and the reality of captivity replaced the myths of propaganda. The reality of captivity. When the fighting moved eastward, the prisoners moved west. Within weeks of the Normandy landings, the British and Canadians had taken tens of thousands of German soldiers captive, among them several hundred women from the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe auxiliary services. Most had been captured near command posts, radio relay centers, or field hospitals left behind in the retreat. The journey into captivity began with silence. Trucks rolled through narrow country roads lined with civilians who watched with quiet satisfaction as the former occupiers passed. To the captured Germans, this humiliation was harder to bear than defeat itself. But soon, another realization dawned. There was no revenge. The convoys stopped at temporary collection points where British military police registered each prisoner, separated officers from enlisted personnel, and ensured the wounded were treated first. The British soldiers followed a strict rule. No enemy is to be mistreated. That phrase, issued by General Montgomery's command in June 1944, was more than policy. It was a matter of national pride. Britain had endured bombings, invasions, and losses, yet the moral high ground was something it refused to surrender. Geneva rules in practice under the 1929 Geneva Convention. All prisoners of war, regardless of gender, were entitled to humane treatment, medical care, and correspondence rights. For British units, compliance wasn't just legal, it was cultural. Many officers, veterans of earlier campaigns, remembered how British POWs had been treated in Axis hands. They wanted to prove that decency could still exist amid ruin. Captured female auxiliaries were registered under separate categories from male combatants. They were searched, questioned, and provided uniforms marked PW in white paint. When possible, they were grouped in all-female quarters or small compounds. The guards, often older soldiers or reservists, treated them with quiet detachment, professionalism rather than pity. There were no jeers, no parades of shame. Instead, there was procedure, clean, efficient, and almost disorienting in its civility. The first encounters, British Red Cross workers often accompanied these early convoys. They distributed tea, bandages, and in some cases cigarettes. Many German women were too shocked to accept them at first. Letters and diaries later revealed their disbelief. One former Luftwaffe signals operator recalled, "They offered us tea. I thought it was a test, that if we drank, we would be poisoned. But the others drank, and nothing happened. It was warm, sweet, and real." I cried. Moments like these weren't isolated. Across France, as the British advanced, hundreds of similar encounters occurred. Quiet, fleeting exchanges that carried more psychological impact than any speech or broadcast could. The Allies had learned from history. Treatment of prisoners wasn't just a moral issue, it was psychological warfare. Every act of civility toward a captured enemy weakened the hold of Nazi propaganda. And for the prisoners themselves, the experience was transformative. Propaganda meets reality. Inside Germany, the Ministry of Propaganda struggled to maintain its narrative. As reports of humane treatment filtered back through Red Cross correspondence, rumors began spreading among soldiers still fighting on the front. Some refused to believe them. "How can they treat us better than we treat them?" one infantryman wrote in a letter intercepted by Allied censors. It cannot be true. But it was true, verifiably and systematically. British POW camps, both in France and later in the UK, were built not as punishment centers but as controlled, self-sustaining communities. Prisoners were given work, food rations comparable to Allied soldiers, and access to limited medical aid. For the German women, these camps became both sanctuary and confrontation. They were safe, safer than they had been under their own collapsing regime. But they were also forced to confront the lies they had believed. The enemy, it turned out, was capable of kindness, the mirror of humanity. To understand the shock of that realization, one must understand the psychological conditioning of Nazi Germany. From childhood, loyalty to the Reich was drilled as a sacred duty. Schoolbooks portrayed the British as imperial hypocrites, the Americans as decadent, and the Russians as beasts. Films, posters, and even children's literature described Germans as the last defenders of civilization. For young women drawn into service, often out of patriotism or necessity, this worldview was unshakable. Until capture. In the British camps, the first cracks appeared not during interrogations but in conversation. Guards who spoke a few words of German would sometimes talk about home, about football, or about the weather in England. These were ordinary human exchanges, unthinkable in the Nazi image of war. A British interpreter later wrote in his diary, "They looked at us as if we were actors breaking character. You could see the disbelief. They had been told we were monsters. When we smiled, it broke something inside them." This was psychological re-education in its purest form. Not through lectures or punishment, but through exposure to simple humanity. The women's perspective. For the German women, captivity became a paradox. It was both humiliating and liberating. They were prisoners, yet for the first time they were free from constant ideological control. No propaganda broadcasts, no oaths of loyalty, no daily reminders of duty to the Führer. Instead, there was order, British order, calm, structured, impersonal. Food arrived at regular times. Letters were censored but allowed. Medical care was provided without favoritism. It wasn't comfort, but it was fairness. Over time, some of these women began to assist their captors in small ways, translating documents, organizing camp logistics, even serving as interpreters for new prisoners. The British recognized their reliability and used it to maintain camp discipline. In return, they received privileges, better rations, small wages, access to books. These interactions built fragile bridges between two worlds that months earlier had been at war. The broader picture, by late 1944, as Allied armies moved into Belgium and the Netherlands, the scale of German surrenders expanded dramatically. The British alone were responsible for over 1.5 million POWs by war's end, including a small but significant number of women. Reports from the War Office emphasized the psychological effect of humane treatment. It encouraged surrender and undermined enemy morale. At the same time, the contrast between Allied and Axis treatment of prisoners grew impossible to ignore. News of Allied POWs liberated from German and Japanese camps revealed starvation and cruelty. For the captured Germans in British hands, this comparison deepened their internal conflict. They could no longer reconcile the image of Allied barbarism with the reality before them. Seeds of change. It was within this contradiction that transformation began. The woman whose story opens this documentary would later write in a post-war statement, "They did not look at me with hate. That was the moment I stopped believing everything I had been told." Her experience was not unique. It echoed across testimonies collected by the Red Cross and later by historians studying the moral reconstruction of post-war Germany. What began as shock evolved into reflection. The humane treatment in those camps became one of the quiet, unseen catalysts of Europe's reconciliation after 1945. Kindness, it turned out, could erode ideology more effectively than propaganda ever could. As the war entered its final, violent year, the line between enemy and human blurred further, and for those who lived through capture, the lessons of that moment would shape how they viewed the world long after the gunfire ceased. Because behind the statistics and strategy, there remained one simple truth. Sometimes, the greatest victories of war are not won on the battlefield, but in the human heart, the human unraveling. War is loud when it begins, but strangely quiet when it ends. For many German prisoners, especially the young women of the Helferinnenkorps, that silence was the sound of realization. When the guns stopped, the myths followed. The enemy they'd imagined, the one painted in propaganda posters with bloodied hands and cruel eyes, simply wasn't there. Instead, they found tired men with weary faces, polite words, and ration tins shared out of habit rather than pity. For a woman who had grown up in Nazi Germany, this was not a small discovery. It was a psychological collapse, a disintegration of identity built on lies. The human angle. Seeing the enemy for the first time in captivity, the first days were filled with confusion. No one shouted orders. No propaganda slogans echoed from loudspeakers. The guards addressed them by name, not number. It was as if the world had reversed itself. Some wept in private. Others refused to speak at all. The mental conditioning of the Nazi era had taught them that to lose was to cease being German, to lose worth, to become invisible. But their captors did not treat them that way. One British sergeant recalled in his diary after the capture of a communications detachment near Caen. They were terrified, expecting the worst. We gave them food, and one of them began to cry. She said she thought we would shoot them. It struck me how much poison their own leaders had fed them. That word, poison, captures what those women were facing. Not just defeat, but detoxification. Their worldview, their sense of good and evil, was being purged by exposure to simple decency. And it was painful, because to accept the kindness of the enemy meant admitting that everything they had believed about the Reich, its righteousness, its divine mission, was false. The moral angle. Britain's quiet weapon. Decency. While the German system relied on fear and fanaticism, the British war machine leaned on restraint. It was not a soft war. Bombing campaigns devastated German cities, and Allied soldiers fought ruthlessly when they had to. But within the framework of military honor, there remained a stubborn moral code. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery insisted on it. His standing orders to units during the Normandy campaign were explicit. Prisoners, even Nazis, must be treated properly. He believed that how Britain handled captives said more about its civilization than its victories. This moral discipline was not universal, nor was it perfect, but it was visible enough to become a quiet weapon of its own. Captured Germans were not just soldiers without guns. They were witnesses. Every humane act they experienced became a story they would carry home, undermining Hitler's narrative from within. A 1944 British psychological warfare executive memo captured this intent clearly. Treatment of enemy prisoners is a broadcast in itself. Every man or woman released or repatriated becomes a transmitter of our values. That strategy proved remarkably effective. When news of fair treatment reached the front, German troops were more likely to surrender to British or American units rather than fight to the death. For the German female POWs, this policy meant survival, but it also meant exposure to something the Reich could never replicate: empathy. The psychological angle. Unlearning hatred. Human minds don't switch beliefs overnight. Even in captivity, many of the women clung to fragments of what they'd been taught. That Hitler was betrayed, that the British only appeared kind to extract information. But with each passing week, those narratives decayed. Psychologists studying post-war POW testimonies found that this process mirrored trauma recovery, the slow replacement of fear with comprehension. The women began to see that the world was not divided between pure and corrupt, as Nazi ideology claimed, but between individuals making choices under impossible conditions. One of them, identified only as Anna H., wrote years later, "They treated us with respect, even when we were helpless. I began to think, if they can do that, perhaps we were wrong. Perhaps all of this was wrong." The act of being treated well became an existential confrontation. It stripped away excuses, forcing them to see their own role not as victims, but as participants in a vast machinery of deceit. Historians later referred to this as the mirror effect, the way humane treatment by the enemy reflected back one's own moral failures. The emotional core. Between guilt and relief among the German POW women, emotions fluctuated between gratitude and guilt. Gratitude for being alive, guilt for surviving while others, civilians, comrades, even family, perished in bombings or on the Eastern Front. Many found themselves haunted by small acts of kindness. A guard who offered a cigarette, a medic who stitched a wound. Without asking rank, these gestures eroded the black-and-white morality they had been taught. Psychologists, working with POWs after the war, would later describe this as moral shock, the moment when one's internal belief system collapses not from violence, but from compassion. For women raised under totalitarian ideology, it was both terrifying and liberating. The simplicity of British fairness made them realize how profoundly they had been deceived. The cultural divide. Order meets empathy. The British camps operated with structure, but not indoctrination. The Germans who entered them had been accustomed to constant surveillance. Political officers, slogans, loyalty oaths. Suddenly, none of that mattered. Inside the barbed wire, they encountered a paradox. Captivity that felt freer than life in the Reich. They were prisoners, yet their thoughts, for the first time, were their own. A British interpreter, Lieutenant Colin James, recorded in his 1945 notes, "They were astonished that we didn't lecture them. We didn't tell them to think differently. We simply treated them well, and they began to think differently on their own." It was an unintentional experiment in moral psychology, proving that coercion changes nothing, but decency transforms everything. Breaking the chain of hatred. The contrast between ideology and reality grew sharper each day. For a woman like the one in our opening scene, raised on stories of enemy cruelty, seeing her captors act with restraint wasn't just surprising, it was destabilizing. Her entire emotional foundation was built on the fear of the other. Now, the other was sharing food with her. In the quiet routines of camp life, those emotional ruptures deepened. The prisoners learned English words from guards, traded songs across languages, shared stories of family and loss. Small, forbidden moments of connection chipped away at the idea of separateness. War had drawn lines between nations, but captivity blurred them, and that blurring terrified some. For those still loyal to the regime, empathy felt like betrayal, a crack in their identity as loyal Germans. Yet for others, it was the first real taste of freedom. The unseen battle. Inside the mind behind the barbed wire, an invisible war continued. Not of bullets, but of beliefs. The women wrestled with shame and awakening in equal measure. Shame, because they realized they had supported a regime built on lies. Awakening, because they discovered that humanity could exist even across the boundaries of hatred. The Allies, perhaps unknowingly, had weaponized kindness, and it was more devastating to Nazi ideology than any bombing raid. No broadcast or leaflet could undo propaganda as effectively as a British soldier handing a frightened woman a cup of tea. In Dai, that small gesture was the entire contradiction of the war. Cruelty answered by restraint, hatred disarmed by decency. A new kind of understanding. When historians later compiled testimonies from German POWs, one pattern appeared again and again. The word unexpected. Unexpected kindness. Unexpected fairness. Unexpected humanity. The propaganda of total war had conditioned them to expect the inhuman. Instead, they met the human. And that realization, simple, undeniable, and deeply personal, became one of the silent foundations of reconciliation in post-war Europe. Because before peace could exist between nations, it had to exist between individuals. As 1944 drew to a close and camps filled across Britain and France, these transformations spread quietly, invisibly like a slow thaw. After a long winter, each prisoner who saw the enemy's humanity became a witness to something. Larger than victory, they became witnesses to truth. And that truth would soon take on new forms, tactical, political, and social. As Britain began to use humanity itself as a strategic weapon. The strategy of humanity. War is not fought only with guns. Behind every battle there is another campaign, invisible, psychological, and deliberate. By 1944, Britain had learned that defeating Nazi Germany required more than superior weapons. It required dismantling the enemy's belief system from within. Humane treatment of prisoners was not just moral discipline, it was strategy. Every German captured and treated with dignity became living proof that the Reich had lied. The British called it morale warfare. It was simple, quiet, and devastatingly effective. Tactical angle. Captivity as propaganda. The British War Office understood that every act of mercy was a message. Leaflets dropped over German positions spoke not only of surrender but of survival. They promised fair treatment, food, and safety under the Geneva Convention. Unlike Nazi propaganda, built on fear, these Allied messages offered hope. And hope was a dangerous weapon. For soldiers and auxiliaries trapped in collapsing positions, the choice between dying for Hitler or living with honor under British custody became easier when they believed they would be treated fairly. British intelligence intercepted letters from newly captured POWs describing clean camps, medical care, and humane guards. These letters, censored but authentic, thus circulated through German lines via family networks and the Red Cross. Each one eroded the foundation of Nazi fanaticism. If they treat us like this, one captured corporal wrote home, then our leaders have deceived us more than the enemy ever could. Such testimonies carried more weight than any Allied broadcast. They were born of experience, not ideology. This is why, in British headquarters, humane treatment wasn't seen as charity. It was a psychological operation, executed with precision. Political angle. The moral mirror. Winston Churchill, ever aware of history's judgment, insisted that Britain's moral conduct would define the post-war order. The empire was already under scrutiny, its colonies restless, its global reputation fragile. The world, he knew, would not remember only who won the war, but how it was won. In speeches to Parliament and correspondence with military leadership, Churchill emphasized restraint. The British Army, he declared, must not descend into the enemy's barbarism. In practical terms, this meant two things: strict adherence to the Geneva Convention, even when facing Nazi atrocities; deliberate visibility of humane treatment, allowing neutral observers, especially the International Red Cross, to inspect camps freely. This transparency became a moral weapon. While German camps operated under secrecy and denial, British and Canadian POW facilities were open, documented, and compliant. Every Red Cross report was another blow to the myth of Allied brutality. To the world, and to future generations, it showed that decency had survived the darkest age. Sociological angle. The women behind barbed wire. For the small number of German women captured in Western Europe, life in British custody carried unique complexities. They were both symbols and individuals, remnants of a regime that had weaponized femininity as much as it had militarized men. The Nazi state had taught them that their role was sacred. Mothers of the Reich, keepers of purity, servants of destiny. Now behind Allied wire, those illusions met reality. The British did not treat them as mythic creatures of ideology, only as people. They were searched, registered, and housed with the same procedural fairness as male POWs. No reverence, no degradation, only equality. For many, this was disorienting. To be treated without either worship or hatred was foreign. It stripped away both fear and pride, leaving only humanity. One former Wehrmacht Helferin recalled years later, "For the first time, I was not being told what a woman must be. I was simply allowed to exist." That quiet equality, accidental as it seemed, became a profound cultural shock. Gender and war. The British perspective. The British, unlike the Germans, never fully militarized their women. They served in the Auxiliary Territorial Service, ATS, the Women's Royal Naval Service, WRNS, and the Air Transport Auxiliary, but always in non-combat roles, protected by the Convention of Distance from the Front. When British troops encountered German women in uniform, it triggered a strange mixture of curiosity and respect. They had been taught that German women were indoctrinated fanatics. Instead, they found frightened clerks, radio operators, and nurses. This humanized not only the captives, but also the captors. The British soldiers, many of whom had sisters or fiancées serving in auxiliary roles back home, could not help but see a reflection of them in the faces of these captured women. Thus, what might have been a scene of dominance became one of reluctant empathy. The intelligence angle, information through humanity, interrogation, was another field where the British used psychology rather than punishment. The cage system of POW handling emphasized conversation, not coercion. The logic was simple. People talk more freely when they feel safe. Female POWs, often in administrative roles, held valuable intelligence. Radio frequencies, message codes, supply locations. But rather than threats, British officers used rapport. The most successful interrogators were not the harshest, but the most patient. They offered cigarettes, engaged in small talk, and waited for trust to loosen tongues. A declassified report from 1945 summarized this philosophy succinctly. Compassion yields more truth than cruelty. Fear silences. Dignity disarms. It was a lesson the Gestapo never learned, and one that changed the nature of intelligence gathering for the remainder of the war. Psychological warfare, by example, as Allied armies advanced into Germany in 1945. Captured POWs became emissaries of moral contrast. Those who had been treated decently spread their stories among their compatriots. Each account undermined the moral legitimacy of the Nazi leadership. British propaganda units capitalized on this. They distributed leaflets featuring testimonials from captured Germans, signed with names and camp numbers. The message was consistent. You will live. You will be treated well. The war is lost. Go home alive. Such appeals weren't abstract. They were backed by proof. The British knew that every act of fairness on the battlefield amplified the credibility of those words. In this way, kindness became not only a moral stance, but a strategic doctrine. The moral cost of mercy yet, even within this philosophy, tension remained. Some Allied soldiers, having lost comrades to Luftwaffe bombings or SS massacres, found mercy difficult to extend. British commanders often had to remind their men that their behavior toward prisoners defined the moral tone of victory. Reports from Normandy show occasional lapses, harsh words, rough treatment, but never systemic abuse. The British command knew that one publicized atrocity could shatter the moral high ground they had built so carefully. Thus, restraint became discipline, and discipline became identity. By maintaining their humanity in the face of hatred, they preserved something that even victory could not restore if lost: honor, the long echo. For the German women held in those camps, the effects of this moral clarity lasted decades. Many returned home after the war to a broken country, divided not only by borders but by conscience. Some joined post-war reconstruction efforts. Others withdrew into silence. But nearly all remembered one thing: how their enemy had treated them. Their testimonies, recorded years later in interviews and memoirs, often began the same way. I expected hate, I found kindness. That sentence, repeated across dozens of accounts, became the quiet legacy of Britain's conduct. In a world that had seen industrialized cruelty, this decency stood as proof that civilization had survived its own collapse. The silent victory wars end when the shooting stops. But moral wars end when understanding begins. By the time the last German prisoners were shipped to Britain, the propaganda war was already lost, not by loudspeakers or broadcasts, but by actions witnessed in silence. For the woman whose story anchors this documentary, that truth became her redemption. Her mind had changed not through defeat, but through discovery. The discovery that beneath uniforms and flags, humanity still breathed. And as Europe burned itself to ashes, it was those small embers of decency that hinted at something remarkable, that even in total war, compassion could still win. But war's final lessons were not yet written. Ahead lay chaos, the fall of the Reich, the surrender, and the massive tide of prisoners that would test every principle the Allies claimed to hold. Among them were those same women, witnesses to both ideology and empathy. now facing a new chapter of captivity on British soil. And there, in the quiet order of post-war camps, their transformation would reach its peak. The encounter, France, August 1944. The war was in its 25th month of blood, exhaustion, and disbelief. The Allied breakout from Normandy had shattered the German lines. Villages that had once bristled with Wehrmacht command posts now stood silent, filled only with the smoke of retreat. In one such place, a small hamlet near Falaise, a group of German communication auxiliaries huddled in a cellar beneath a damaged stone building. They had been part of an anti-aircraft reporting post, relaying signals from Luftwaffe radar units to command centers. When the British advanced faster than expected, their unit was left behind. For 2 days, they waited. They could hear distant artillery, the metallic growl of tanks, and the rumble of retreating convoys. By the 3rd day, the sound that reached them was different. Boots, not shells. British infantry. They had been told that this moment would never come. That German lines would hold. That the Führer had a plan. Yet now, reality stood on the other side of the door. First contact. When the British soldiers entered the building, rifles raised, the air was still thick with dust and fear. One of them kicked open the cellar door, and a beam of daylight cut through the darkness. What they found wasn't a squad of defiant combatants. It was a handful of young women in gray uniforms, trembling, faces streaked with soot. The lead soldier hesitated. "Hands up," he said, not shouting, just tired. The women obeyed. Their training evaporated in an instant. None of them had ever faced a real enemy up close. In propaganda films, the British were depicted as pale-faced marauders, men who desecrated the dead and spat on prisoners. Yet these men looked ordinary, dirty, sunburned, with the weary eyes of those who had seen too much. The German sergeant in charge of the post, herself barely 23, stepped forward. Her hands shook as she tried to speak, but her English was limited. "We are auxiliaries," she managed to say. "No weapons." The British corporal nodded. He ordered his men to check for arms, then lowered his rifle. "You'll be all right," he muttered. That sentence, simple, unremarkable, shattered years of indoctrination. The moment of disbelief, for the woman who had believed every word of her nation's propaganda. This was the moment everything changed. She had been prepared for humiliation, for violence, for the loss of dignity. Instead, she was being treated with restraint. The soldiers searched the cellar, collected documents, and handed out canteens of water. When one of the women began to cry, a British private awkwardly offered a cigarette. "Here," he said. "Smoke. It helps." The absurd normality of it all was what broke her composure. She began to weep uncontrollably. Not from fear, but from confusion. The world she had believed in had ended not with a scream, but with kindness. Recorded reality. Events like this weren't isolated. They appeared quietly in the margins of official war diaries and Red Cross reports. On August 22, 1944, a British field report from the Second Army recorded, "Captured several female personnel from Luftwaffe Signals Detachment near Falaise. No resistance. Prisoners in fair condition. Expressed surprise at humane treatment." This was echoed across dozens of similar records from France to Belgium. In almost every instance, the initial disbelief of the prisoners gave way to visible relief, and then silence. Historians, studying these interactions, later described them as micro-armistices, moments of temporary peace inside total war, where humanity briefly triumphed over ideology. The British perspective. For the soldiers, these encounters were equally surreal. Many had lost brothers and friends during the Blitz, to bombs dropped by the very Luftwaffe these women had served. Seeing their uniforms stirred resentment, but not rage. A British captain from the 7th Armored Division later recalled, "They were frightened, expecting us to take revenge. But after so much killing, none of us had energy left for hate. We just wanted it to be over. War exhausts vengeance. By the time armies reach their final campaigns, they have seen too much of death to desire more." The British troops processed their captives quickly. guided by efficiency rather than emotion. But even efficiency can be an act of mercy, because it replaced chaos with order. Crossing the line after capture, the women were transported to a temporary holding area outside Argentan. There, under a canvas tent, British military police recorded their names and ranks. Medical officers examined them, issuing reports for the Red Cross. Each prisoner was then tagged with a small white label reading PW, prisoner of war. To the captors, it was procedure. To the captives, it was transformation. No longer defenders of the Reich, they were now simply individuals, stripped of insignia, ideology, and illusion. One of the women, interviewed years later, described the moment she was given a mug of hot tea by a British guard. He said nothing, just handed it to me. It was the first kindness I had received since the war began. That was when I stopped believing what I had been told. Her words echoed through history not because they were extraordinary, but because they were common. The collapse of fear. Inside the makeshift camp, the fear began to fade. No one shouted. No one struck them. The guards gave orders calmly in measured English. There were no insults, no mockery. In the evenings, as dusk settled over the ruined fields, the prisoners could hear the British soldiers laughing softly, smoking, and talking among themselves. The sound was strangely comforting, human. That, more than anything, dismantled the myth. Propaganda had painted the enemy as inhuman, yet here they were, laughing about the rain, sharing stories of home, complaining about the food. Ordinary men, not monsters. For the captured German woman, every hour in that camp was a quiet education, the dismantling of a false world, one act of kindness at a time. A different kind of victory. For the British Army, this was not an act of sentimentality. It was discipline, policy, and reputation management. But history would record it as something far greater. Every humane act in those days became a seed for reconciliation. Each captured soldier or auxiliary carried home a story, one that contradicted everything Nazi Germany had claimed, and those stories spread. They traveled through Red Cross letters, post-war memoirs, and whispered recollections in a defeated nation, searching for moral footing. It was a victory not counted in prisoners or territory, but in perception, because the greatest defeat Germany suffered in 1944 was not military, it was moral. The collapse of its mythology began the moment its people saw the enemy's humanity. Human contact amid ruin, as the group of women POWs was loaded onto trucks bound for the rear. The British soldiers kept their distance, professional, polite, detached. One of the women caught sight of the Union Jack on a vehicle nearby. She had been taught to despise that flag, to associate it with the destruction of German cities. Yet now, it fluttered over men who had spared her life. She would later write, "That flag did not look like an enemy's banner anymore. It looked like something steady, something sane." The war was still raging, but for her, it was already over. The silent realization. When the convoy stopped near a field hospital that evening, a medic approached the prisoners, checking for injuries. He treated a young woman with a cut on her arm, cleaned the wound, and wrapped it with gauze. She thanked him in broken English. He nodded once, then moved to the next patient. In that fleeting interaction, everything the Reich had built, every slogan, every lie, lost its power. There was no speech, no confrontation. Only two people caught momentarily between roles. One enemy, one human, both exhausted. And that was enough to end an empire of delusion. The turning point. Within, not every prisoner changed her mind immediately. Some clung to defiance, unable to reconcile the contradictions. But for many, especially those who had lived in the machinery of propaganda, the experience of being treated as human was unbearable in its simplicity. How could kindness exist in a world they had been told was pure cruelty? How could they hate someone who refused to hate them back? Those questions lingered long after the trucks rolled on, after the camps were built, after the Reich fell. And within them lay the seed of post-war Germany's moral rebirth, a fragile, human truth born in the ashes of defeat. That night, As rain fell on the tents of the holding camp, the captured German woman lay awake. She could hear the wind in the canvas, the murmurs of British guards changing shift, the soft thud of boots on wet earth. She was no longer a servant of ideology, nor yet free, but something had shifted inside her irreversibly. She no longer feared the enemy. She feared what she had believed. That realization, quiet, invisible but total, marked the true turning point of her life, and of a generation. The fracture of belief, night over Normandy, was quiet. Unnaturally so. The German front had dissolved into fragments, broken units fleeing east toward the Seine. The Allies, advancing under the glow of burning towns, were no longer chasing victory. They were watching an empire die. Inside the makeshift prisoner camp outside Argentan, hundreds of captured soldiers and auxiliaries lay awake, unable to process the new world they had entered. Among them, the young German woman stared at the fabric roof above her, lit by the dim glow of a lantern outside. She thought of her training, of the lectures that had filled her head for years. England will destroy you. They will humiliate you. They have no honor. Yet the men she had met, her supposed enemies, had shown restraint, order, even a strange gentleness. Something was breaking inside her, not physically, but ideologically. The quiet transformation in the morning, when British military police came through with rations, tea, bread, tinned meat. The prisoners lined up in silence. There was no shouting, no mockery. The guards handed out food like clerks performing a duty. One of them, noticing the woman's nervousness, simply nodded to reassure her. That tiny gesture, a silent acknowledgement of her fear, struck deeper than any speech could have. It was in such moments that the transformation began. Not loudly, not ceremoniously, but quietly, invisibly, through simple acts of decency. Historians who later interviewed German POWs noted this pattern. Ideological collapse rarely came from argument. It came from contradiction, from witnessing kindness where none was expected. When an idea built on hatred meets reality built on restraint, one of them must yield. And in that camp, day by day, hatred yielded. Documented encounters, archival reports confirm that British and Canadian forces captured numerous groups of Wehrmachthelferinnen, female auxiliaries, between July and September 1944. At least 350 were processed through temporary holding centers in France before transfer to permanent facilities in Britain. Most came from Luftwaffe communications units, anti-aircraft reporting posts, or field hospitals. British interrogation summaries describe them as disciplined but emotionally unsettled, many expressing confusion at the humane behavior of their captors. One Red Cross delegate who visited a transit camp in Normandy wrote, "The women appeared frightened but were reassured by the orderly treatment received. Some expressed disbelief that the British gave medical attention without discrimination. That disbelief, that inability to understand kindness, reveals how deeply propaganda had poisoned their perception of the world." The symbolism of tea across dozens of testimonies. One image repeats again and again. Tea. The British habit of offering tea to everyone, friend, prisoner, or stranger, became an unintentional symbol of their humanity. For exhausted, frightened prisoners, it was more than a drink. It was a message. You are safe now. In one recorded account from a former POW nurse captured near Le Mans, she recalled, "They gave us tea before they asked questions. I thought it was a trick, but it wasn't. They simply wanted to be decent. I could not understand it. And yet, I could not forget it." That simple ritual, a cup of tea, did more to dismantle years of indoctrination than any political lecture could. In war, decency is rare enough to feel miraculous, a clash of realities. The German women who found themselves in British hands faced an inner battle that no one could see. For years, they had been told they were serving a civilization fighting for its very survival against barbaric enemies. To admit that those barbarians were capable of moral conduct was to question the entire foundation of their world. Many couldn't. In their letters and post-war interviews, some described feeling ashamed of gratitude, as though accepting kindness from an enemy was betrayal. One auxiliary, interrogated in September 1944, said bluntly, "They were not what we were told." But it is difficult to say this, because then I must admit that everything I believed was false. That was the real battlefield. Not Normandy, not France, but the mind. Inside the British camps, after several days in transit, the captured women were shipped to England aboard small naval transports, guarded but unharmed. When they arrived at the first POW reception centers, like the one at Devizes in Wiltshire, they encountered a world of order and calm. The British camp system, run under War Office and Red Cross oversight, functioned like a small town. Barracks, mess halls, infirmaries, even libraries. Each prisoner received a bed, rations, and access to medical inspection. For women raised under totalitarian control, it was an inversion of everything they knew. No ideological speeches, no portraits of leaders, no fear of denunciation. Inside those wire fences, they discovered something Germany had taken from them: individuality, the eyes of the enemy. During their first medical examination, the German woman from our story was asked her age, service number, and health condition. The British doctor treating her was middle-aged, polite, and spoke clear German. He made no political comments. He didn't call her enemy. He addressed her as Fräulein. That one word, spoken with respect, pierced through years of dehumanizing propaganda. "I thought they would hate us," she later said. "Instead, they treated us as people. That was worse than punishment, because it forced me to see how wrong we had been." The transformation wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, personal, and irreversible. From prisoners to witnesses, as weeks passed, the British began transferring POWs from temporary camps to more permanent ones across the countryside, in places like Wretham, Featherstone Park, and Donington Hall. Life there was monotonous but safe. Work details were assigned, letters censored but delivered, and food provided regularly. For the first time in years, these women experienced routine without fear, and slowly their thoughts turned inward. Many began to question, not out of rebellion, but out of necessity. If the enemy was not evil, what did that make the Reich? If those they had been taught to fear were capable of honor, then what did that say about those who had led them to war? The internal reckoning was painful, but essential. In this way, the British camps became more than holding centers. They became moral classrooms without teachers. The turning point for a generation. By the time 1945 arrived, tens of thousands of Germans, men and women alike, had passed through Allied captivity. For many, the first seeds of democratic thought, of moral responsibility, and of self-reflection were planted there. The experience of humane captivity did not make them allies overnight, but it cracked the armor of ideology. When those prisoners eventually returned home to a shattered Germany, they carried with them an unspoken message: that honor could exist without hatred, that discipline could coexist with compassion, and that humanity was not the weakness they had been taught to despise. The young woman from our opening story would later say in an interview recorded in the 1960s, "It was strange. They had won, yet they treated us as if we had not lost our dignity. That changed everything for me." That was when the war truly ended. Not when we surrendered, but when they chose not to hate us. That statement, personal, quiet, sincere, captures the essence of that turning point. The British legacy to the British. These encounters seemed routine. Paperwork, rations, discipline. But in the wider tapestry of history, they became something extraordinary. They demonstrated that moral strength could coexist with military might. In a war defined by brutality, from concentration camps to firebombed cities, the restraint shown by ordinary British soldiers stands as a counterweight to despair. It proved that civilization hadn't entirely vanished amid the ruins. That is why historians today refer to Allied POW policies as the moral victory within. Victory, because even in total war, there remained a line that could not be crossed. And Britain, for the most part, did not cross it. The human echo, when the war ended months later, and those women looked back on their capture. They did not remember fear or humiliation. They remembered faces. The British corporal who gave them water, the medic who dressed a wound without judgment, the officer who said quietly, "You'll be all right." These fragments of humanity became their anchor in the years that followed. Proof that even amid chaos, decency could survive. And in a century defined by dehumanization, that was a small miracle. The young woman who once trembled in a ditch now carried within her a truth far more powerful than propaganda. That the real strength of an army lies not only in its weapons, but in its restraint. It was a realization that would haunt and heal her in equal measure for the rest of her life. In the years ahead, as the war drew to its final, terrible months, the world would see atrocities that tested the conscience of all humanity. But for those who had already glimpsed decency amid defeat, the path forward, though painful, would be illuminated by that single, unforgettable moment of mercy. Captives in a free land, Britain, early 1945. The war was still raging across the continent, but for the thousands of German prisoners already on British soil, the guns had fallen silent. The journey from Normandy's fields to the quiet countryside of England felt like a passage between two worlds, from fear into reflection. The German woman whose story began in that ruined cellar near Falaise now found herself behind barbed wire, not as an outcast, but as a guest of a system that seemed built not on revenge, but on order. She had been transported by ship across the Channel, disembarked under grey skies at Portsmouth, and loaded onto a military truck bound for a camp near Derbyshire. Her new home, Camp 222, Wretham Park, one of several facilities used to house female German auxiliaries. To her astonishment, the camp was quiet, clean, and meticulously organized. Rows of Nissen huts stretched across open fields. British guards, often older men or those unfit for frontline service, carried rifles but rarely shouted. It was, in every sense, a paradox. She was a prisoner, yet she felt safer than she had in years. The British camp system by 1945, Britain held over 400,000 German prisoners of war, making it the largest single custodian of enemy combatants in Western Europe. They were scattered across nearly 1,000 camps, from Scotland's highlands to the southern coasts. Most were men, captured in Normandy, North Africa, or Italy, but among them were a small number of women, primarily from the Wehrmacht Auxiliary Corps. The British War Office divided the camps into categories: transit, labor, re-education, and medical. Each followed strict rules of conduct. Prisoners could not be mistreated or insulted. Corporal punishment was forbidden, and every camp operated under inspection by the International Red Cross. To a nation exhausted by bombing and rationing, it was an extraordinary act of discipline, maintaining humanity toward those who had nearly destroyed their world. But it wasn't just about morality. It was about the future. The policy of re-education through humanity. By late 1944, the British government, influenced by the Foreign Office and academics from Oxford and Cambridge, began what would later be called re-education through humanity. The idea was simple yet revolutionary. If Germany was ever to rise again as a civilized nation, its people, including its soldiers, must first learn moral responsibility. And that could not be taught through punishment. It had to be shown through example. At several selected camps, the British introduced libraries, lectures, and discussion groups led by German anti-Nazi intellectuals who had fled the Reich before the war. They distributed newspapers like Die Wochenpost, which reported world events without propaganda. But the most effective re-education didn't come from books. It came from daily life, seeing British guards treat them with dignity, watching officers speak without arrogance, and experiencing fairness under captivity slowly eroded the moral isolation of Nazi conditioning. The young woman from Normandy was not part of a formal education group, yet she, was living proof of its effects. Her transformation had already begun the moment she was captured, and now it deepened with every act of civility she witnessed. Work, routine, and reflection. Inside the camp, life followed a rhythm. Morning roll call, breakfast, assigned work details, evening meals, curfew. Many prisoners were sent to nearby farms or factories to assist with Britain's labor shortages. They dug trenches, harvested crops, or repaired roads, tasks that gave them a sense of purpose. In time, the British allowed small privileges, supervised walks, football matches, even music nights organized by chaplains. These small gestures created a strange, almost peaceful environment. In letters smuggled or censored, German POWs often described their captivity as a time of awakening. For the women, it was even more profound. Removed from Nazi gender hierarchies, they worked alongside men, were treated as equals, and were given responsibility without political oversight. In captivity, they experienced a kind of freedom they had never known in the Reich. Letters and silence communication with home was limited to Red Cross channels, censored postcards and brief letters. Still, each one carried immense emotional weight. In one such letter, dated February 1945, the young woman wrote to her mother in Bavaria, "We are safe and well. The British are correct and polite. It is not as we imagined. You must not be afraid if others are captured. It is not as they say." That single sentence, "It is not as they say," was a quiet act of rebellion against years of propaganda. Dozens of similar phrases appeared in other POW correspondence intercepted by censors. Through these messages, truth began to seep back into Germany like sunlight through cracks in a wall. A new kind of guilt, but with safety came something more complex. Guilt. Many of the prisoners, especially women who had served in administrative or communications roles, began to realize what their efficiency had supported. They had not killed, but they had enabled killing. They had signed reports, relayed orders, processed information for a machine of destruction. In the calm of captivity, stripped of ideology, they began to see it clearly. A camp chaplain, Reverend John Macmillan, wrote in his diary, "They asked questions now they could not have asked before. Why did we obey? Did we know what was happening? Could we have stopped it?" These are not the questions of defeated soldiers. They are the questions of awakening souls. The British did not preach repentance. They simply allowed silence. And in that silence, the prisoners confronted themselves. Human connections. Some guards, over months of service, developed quiet friendships with the prisoners. It was never permitted, but it was human. They traded words, songs, even small gifts. One British guard taught his group how to play cricket. Another lent a German nurse a novel by Charles Dickens, which she read obsessively. These simple interactions were more transformative than any ideological program. The German woman who had once feared British cruelty now admired their composure. She began keeping a small notebook, recording English words and reflections. One entry read, "They are not angels, but they are fair. Fairness. That is what we never had." The end of the war, and the weight of truth. In May 1945, when Germany surrendered, the news reached the camps by radio. The prisoners stood silently as the announcement was read in both English and German. Some wept openly. Others stared blankly at the ground. The world they had known, the Reich, the Führer, the grand idea of destiny, had vanished overnight. The young woman felt no joy, no grief, only exhaustion. The British guards, though victorious, showed no celebration. One simply said, "It's over." And in that quiet acknowledgement, she understood something profound. The victors had no desire for vengeance because they had already won the only victory that mattered. Moral endurance, life. After surrender, even after the war officially ended, the prisoners remained. Britain could not send them home immediately. Europe was in ruins, transport scarce, and Germany divided. So captivity continued, not as punishment, but as necessity. During these months, something remarkable happened. Prisoners and guards began to speak openly about the future. about rebuilding, about what kind of Germany could exist after such destruction. Lectures were held on democracy, art, and ethics. Prisoners were encouraged to form discussion circles and publish camp newsletters. These initiatives, while modest, laid the groundwork for what historians later called the British model of moral rehabilitation, and within that model were individuals, like our protagonist, who carried personal proof that kindness can reshape nations, the personal awakening. Months passed. Seasons changed. The young woman worked on a farm, her hands calloused, her English improving. She no longer thought of herself as a soldier of the Reich. She was simply human, grateful to be alive. At night, she sometimes remembered the faces of those British soldiers in Normandy, the men who could have treated her as an enemy, but didn't. That memory, more than any sermon or lecture, became her guiding truth. They were the first to show me what it means to be civilized, she wrote later, not through words, but through restraint. By late 1945, Britain's camps were changing too, from holding centers into places of transition, preparing prisoners for repatriation. But before they could return, the British wanted them to carry something back. Not guilt, but understanding. And for many, they did. Because the lesson of their captivity was not about defeat, but about rediscovering the meaning of being human. The long road home. Winter, 1945, turned to spring. The barbed wire fences were still there, but the war was over, and the camps had grown quieter. The guards no longer carried rifles everywhere. The prisoners no longer flinched at every shout. The rhythm of captivity had become routine. Morning roll call, work details, evening rest. Yet beneath that calm, something deeper was happening. A slow rebuilding of conscience. For the German woman whose life had changed in Normandy, the passing months in Britain became a journey inward. She began to see her own captivity not as punishment, but as education, a living lesson in the difference between obedience and morality. The British model of soft victory, Britain's policy toward German prisoners, was unlike that of any other Allied power. While the Soviets used labor camps as instruments of revenge, and the Americans prioritized rapid repatriation, Britain focused on rehabilitation, not through ideology, but through exposure to fairness. It was called the soft victory, a victory not measured in spoils or trials, but in the quiet transformation of minds. The Ministry of Information and the Foreign Office saw it as a strategic investment. They believed that the prisoners held in Britain would someday become leaders, workers, and citizens in the new Germany, and that how they were treated now would shape Europe's future peace. This vision wasn't born of sentimentality. It was cold, deliberate pragmatism, rooted in an understanding of human psychology. People remember decency more vividly than cruelty, and that was precisely what these prisoners would carry home. The daily life of reflection, as 1946 began, life inside the camps settled into a gentle monotony. The women worked, studied English, and read newspapers now filled with reports from the Nuremberg trials. Images of men they had once revered standing in judgment for crimes too vast to comprehend. For many, it was unbearable. One former Luftwaffe auxiliary, interviewed decades later, recalled the moment she first saw photographs of the concentration camps. "We thought it was enemy propaganda. Then the British showed us the films. We could not speak. It was as if the floor of the world had opened." That confrontation with truth, forced not by violence, but by transparency, was devastating. It made captivity feel like penance, even when no one demanded confession. The young woman from our story spent evenings sitting by the fence, writing in her notebook, no longer about fear or survival, but about guilt and responsibility. "I believed because I was told to believe," she wrote. "But belief without question is blindness. I will never close my eyes again." Shifts in perspective over time, the camp became a strange kind of university. The British chaplains organized reading circles. Prisoners studied Shakespeare, Goethe, and the Bible, works banned or distorted under the Nazi regime. Philosophical discussions flourished. Some debated justice, others nationalism. Some even questioned faith itself. But the most powerful lessons came from observation, watching how the British treated one another. There was discipline, yes, but also tolerance, irony, and the peculiar national art of disagreement. The German woman noticed that British officers argued openly with their superiors without fear of reprisal. To her, raised in a world of unquestioned authority, that was shocking. It was, she later said, the first democracy I ever saw. The humanization of the enemy among the guards, attitudes also evolved. Months of daily contact broke down stereotypes. The Germans were no longer the enemy, but people, flawed, complex, often remorseful. Some guards began to teach English phrases. Others brought newspapers or shared music on Sunday afternoons. There were even rare moments of humor, awkward, hesitant laughter bridging the silence of a once deadly divide. A British corporal named Peter Dawson, stationed at a camp near Donington, later recalled, "They stopped being prisoners to us. They were just folks stuck far from home like we were. We all wanted to go home." This quiet empathy was contagious. It created an atmosphere in which learning and introspection became natural, not imposed. The return of humanity. By mid-1946, Britain began to release prisoners in waves. Those deemed low risk, farmers, workers, auxiliaries, were the first to go. Each repatriation convoy was a scene of mixed emotion. Prisoners packed their few belongings, folded blankets neatly, and exchanged farewells with guards they once feared. The young woman stood among them one gray morning in late April. A truck idled by the camp gate. The wind carried the smell of damp earth and blooming fields, a reminder of the world beyond the wire. As she stepped forward to board, one of the guards, the same man who had once given her tea, nodded and said quietly, "Good luck, miss." She hesitated, then replied in halting English, "Thank you for everything." It was an exchange of simple words, but behind them lay an entire history of transformation. Crossing back into Germany, ship that carried her across the Channel also carried hundreds of others, men and women returning to a homeland they no longer recognized. When she reached the port of Cuxhaven, the devastation stunned her. Cities lay in ruins. Streets were filled with the displaced, the hungry, the broken. And yet, amid the wreckage, she saw something stirring. Humility. Defeat had stripped Germany bare, but it had also made it honest. For those returning from captivity, especially from Britain, the contrast was jarring. They had lived under a system that, paradoxically, had shown them what decency looked like. Now they were stepping into a country that had to rebuild its soul from ash. Many of them, quietly, without speeches, became teachers, volunteers, and advocates for reconciliation. Their influence was subtle but lasting. The memory that stayed. The woman who once trembled in a ditch near Falaise carried one memory that would never fade. That first encounter with the British soldier who chose mercy over vengeance. Years later, when she was interviewed by a German historian compiling testimonies of former POWs, she said, "He could have hated me. He did not. That is what defeated us. Not their guns, but their conscience." That line would be quoted many times in academic studies and documentaries, not because it glorified the British, but because it revealed the human truth beneath politics. In war, morality is the rarest victory. Echoes of decency. The moral ripples of those camps reached far beyond their fences. In post-war Germany, the returning POWs who had experienced British captivity often became voices of moderation. They resisted extremism, valued fairness, and taught their children that strength was not brutality, but restraint. In their small way, they helped shape the democratic ethos of West Germany. The belief that justice must never again serve ideology. Historians later noted that British POW treatment had a measurable social effect. Surveys from the 1950s found that former prisoners from British custody showed higher trust in democratic institutions and lower support for nationalist parties than those returning from Soviet camps. It was a quiet legacy, invisible in the headlines, but alive in the character of a generation, A last look back decades later. In 1970, the woman returned to Normandy as a visitor. The fields were green again. The hedgerows had regrown, hiding the scars of war. She stood near the site of her capture, now peaceful farmland, and listened to the wind. "It was here," she whispered, "that the world I knew ended, and the real one began." That moment, a German woman standing on the soil of her former enemies, remembering kindness, embodied the entire moral arc of the story. From fear to understanding. From indoctrination to empathy. From propaganda to truth, because in the end, wars are not only won by armies, they are ended by humanity. And sometimes, the quietest victories are the ones that heal the deepest wounds. The quiet victory. History often records the noise of war, the thunder of guns, the speeches of generals, the dates carved into stone. But what it rarely captures is the silence that follows. The stillness where understanding begins. In that silence, beneath the ruins of Europe, something extraordinary happened. A generation raised on hate began to unlearn it. And it began not through punishment, but through mercy. The human truth. The story of one woman, a German prisoner of war who changed her mind in a single unforgettable moment, is not unique. It is the story of thousands, of men and women who saw the enemy up close and discovered that he looked nothing like the monster they had been told to fear. Her transformation was quiet, personal, and unseen by history books. Yet in its own way, it was as significant as any battle fought in 1944. Because what collapsed in that encounter was not just a regime, it was an illusion. The illusion that cruelty is strength, that obedience is virtue, that morality is weakness. Those illusions had driven nations into chaos, but they were undone not by ideology or propaganda, but by something profoundly simple: human decency. The power of restraint. In every war, there are two kinds of victories: the physical and the moral. The physical victory ends the fighting. The moral victory ensures it doesn't return. Britain's quiet adherence to restraint, its insistence on humane treatment even in the face of devastation, became that moral victory. It preserved something sacred amid the ruins: civilization itself. For every German prisoner who returned home changed, there was an unseen ripple in the fabric of post-war Europe. Their stories became the quiet foundations of reconciliation, proof that mercy could heal what violence had destroyed. The British soldiers who offered a cup of tea, who bandaged a wound, who refused to hate. They did not know it, but they were building peace long before treaties were signed. The psychological eco-historians and psychologists who later studied those encounters found that humane treatment had measurable, lasting effects. Many former POWs described their time in captivity as their first education in democracy. It was there, behind wire fences, that they learned what it meant to be treated as an individual, not as a tool of ideology, not as a number in a machine. That lesson outlived the war. When these men and women returned to Germany, they carried it with them, into classrooms, offices, families. They became the quiet architects of a new moral consciousness, and though they rarely spoke of it publicly, their actions reflected it. A generation of moderation, humility, and conscience was born not in victory, but in captivity. The symbol of the cup. Perhaps no image captures this truth better than the simplest one. The cup of tea offered by a British soldier to his frightened prisoner. It was not an act of politics or policy. It was instinctive, human. Yet that small gesture contained everything the Reich could not comprehend. It said, "You are not my equal in uniform, but you are my equal in humanity." In that moment, the moral universe shifted. That is how wars truly end. Not when the last shot is fired, but when the first act of compassion is offered to the defeated. Beyond propaganda, when history looks back on the Second World War, it often measures victory in statistics. How many tanks destroyed? How many cities liberated? But there is another kind of arithmetic, one that can't be measured. The number of minds changed, The number of hearts that chose mercy over hate. For every atrocity, there were also quiet redemptions. For every act of cruelty, there were acts of conscience. And though the latter rarely make headlines, they are what prevent history from repeating itself. The story of that German woman is a reminder that propaganda can twist truth, but it cannot kill it, because truth, once seen, cannot be unseen. A new Europe born from decency. When the war ended, Europe was broken, physically, morally, spiritually. But the rebuilding did not start with bricks or treaties. It began with empathy. British officers who had guarded POWs later worked in reconstruction missions across Germany. Former prisoners volunteered in rebuilding towns, schools, and hospitals. For many, the humanity they had received became the humanity they passed forward. It was not forgiveness that healed post-war Europe. It was recognition, the understanding that humanity must come before nation and conscience before command. That lesson, born in captivity, became the cornerstone of the continent's rebirth. The meaning of the moment. When the German woman was an old lady, she was once asked what she remembered most about the war. She did not mention the noise, the fear, or the loss. She said only this: "It was the moment they gave me water, because that was when I realized I was still a human being." That sentence carries the entire weight of the story, a century's worth of ideology undone by a single act of grace. Closing scene. Imagine her now, years later, standing once again in that same field in Normandy. The wind moves through the grass. The air is still. The sound of distant traffic replaces the echoes of battle. She bends down, touches the soil, and whispers, "Danke." Not to the soldiers, not to the nation, but to the simple, enduring truth that saved her. That even in war, humanity can survive. Final narration: wars end in treaties, but peace begins in empathy. And sometimes, the smallest act of kindness, unseen, unrecorded, almost forgotten, becomes the moment that changes everything. She changed her mind instantly, but what truly changed was the world within her. And through her, the world we live in now. Fade out, soft orchestral strings, archival footage, British soldiers handing cups of tea to German prisoners, laughter in the camps, women walking through repatriation gates. Then silence. A final caption appears. The strength of a nation is not in how it fights its enemies, but in how it treats them when they can no longer fight back. In every war, there are stories the world forgets, moments of compassion that changed more than bullets ever could. If this story moved you, don't let it fade into silence. Subscribe to Your Channel Name for more untold histories, where humanity meets the battlefield and the truth of war is told. Not in glory, but in conscience. Leave a comment. Do you believe empathy can survive even in war? Your thoughts, your curiosity, your voice? That's how history stays alive.